And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Nicole. Thanks, ladies.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having us, and thank you to everybody for taking some time out of your afternoon to learn with us. We're really excited to be here. I'm Sarah Westbrook. I'm from the Right Question Institute, and I'm a former English teacher in the Boston area. And I'm totally thrilled to be here with Nicole, who I've worked with for the last several years, and I'll let her introduce herself.
I'm Nicole Bolduc. I teach 7th grade science at Ellington Middle School, and I've been playing around and tinkering with the QFT for the past several years and have known Sarah for that long too. And I've been in the classroom for this is my 17th year teaching.
And we're really thrilled to share some of Nicole's work today. And as you heard, there will be a second follow-up webinar coming at the end of the month where she'll be sharing even more of that and getting into some of the more detailed, granular pieces. So one thing I want everybody to know is today is designed to be highly interactive. We want you to participate if you feel moved to in the chat box. And so there will be some moments coming up where we're going to ask you to do some active work with questions and with phenomena. So stay tuned for that. So I just want to do a little bit of acknowledging. Thank you so much to our hosts. We're really happy to be here. And thank you for all the work behind the screen to Andrew too, and to Aida. We are tweeting today. If you feel inclined to tweet, please follow us. These are our handles and hashtags that you can find us. So you're going to find two different icons throughout the webinar. There is this thinking bubble, and that means that we're asking you not to share anything at that moment. We're going to be asking you to do some work on your own. So it would be good to have some paper nearby or a Word document that you can toggle between on your screen. And then you'll also see that blue chat box. And when you see that pop up, that means that get ready to share some of your work in the chat box. And I'll also come in and say, use the chat box now. So there will be no question when you should be using the chat box. Okay. So I think it would be really wonderful to learn a little bit about who is in the room today. So if you can, please share your first name and maybe where you're joining us from just in the chat box. And Nicole can read some of those out. We also have a little poll for you today too. So if you can see the poll, so introduce yourself, use your chat box, and then if you can take the poll, we're very curious to hear some of the experience you're coming in with.
So while they're taking the poll, I can read off some of the names and where people are from. We have Brian from Orlando, Florida, Mark from Austin, Texas, Lindsay from Climate Generation in Minneapolis, Tiffany Morgan from Iowa, Savannah from Connecticut, Katie, a 5th grade teacher from California, Roseville, Heather from Old Lyme, Connecticut. Got a few Connecticut people in here. Todd from East Hanover, New Jersey. Steve, he's a staff developer in Trenton, Nebraska. Tabitha from Maine. Liz from Flemington, New Jersey. Veronica from Michigan. Joan from Cape Cod, Mass. We have Amy from Columbia High School in White Salmon, Washington. Deborah from New Jersey. Abby teaches 5th and 6th grade in Bloomington, Indiana. Carly from Reno, Nevada. Sharon McKinney from Arkansas, Department of Education. Katie from Marshall, Illinois High School, Library. Morgan from Connecticut with Connecticut Audubon. Paul from DeKalb, Illinois. Andrew from Milwaukee. Jason from Maryland. And the list goes on. Would you like me to keep reading them?
Well, maybe we'll pause.
But this is great.
It's really wonderful to see the breadth of people who are able to join. That's wonderful. And it looks like there are a lot of people in our virtual room who are not at all familiar with the question formulation technique, and some people who are a little more familiar. So whether you know the QFT really well, That's question formulation technique, or not at all, you're in the right place. So we're going to do an introduction to the technique, and then we'll show some of the ways you can apply it in an NGSS-based classroom. So thank you. Welcome to all. And I think I might stop sharing the results of this poll now, but that's very interesting, very cool to see. Okay, here's some of the results. All right, so like I said, we're spending some time just establishing the skill of question formulation and some of the research around that and why that's an important piece of what we do in the classroom. We are going to do some collaborative learning with using the technique, where we are learning the technique through doing it, and then we'll explore some applications, and we're saving lots of time for your questions. It would not be the Right Question Institute unless we were saving lots of time for questions. So you can access all of our materials online. So this is the link for you. There's an educator network with a bunch of free resources there. That's really, a lot of people find that useful. All of the resources that the Right Question Institute puts out are completely free and open for educators to use. And all we do is ask that you cite the source whenever you're producing something about the Right Question Institute or the question formulation technique. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking about why it's important to teach the skill of question formulation. And for that, I'm going to go back to the original source of all of the work that I do and my organization does, and that was working with parents in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1990. And this was a group of low-income and immigrant parents who were involved in a dropout prevention program for their children. And one of the things Dan and Luce, the founders of my organization, kept hearing from parents was that they weren't going to school and they weren't participating in some of the decision making around their children's education because they didn't even know what questions to ask. And so Dan and Luce initially responded by giving parents lists of questions. So there was a different list of questions for every situation. Here's a list of questions for an IEP meeting. Here's a list of questions for a school board meeting. And what they found was that that built dependency. So people had named something so much more fundamental about learning and self-advocacy, which is that you don't need to be given lists of questions. You need to know how to ask questions nimbly and strategically in any setting or situation that you're in. So it turns out that those parents had named something that a lot of researchers and educators have been talking about for a long time. So one quote we absolutely love is this one by Richard Feynman, who said, "There is no learning without having to pose a question." And this is another highly recommended book from Stuart Firestein. And Stuart Firestein works at Columbia, and he has two courses, one about ignorance and one about failure. So he likes to joke with his students, you know, are you sure you want to get an A in this course? Because on your transcript, it's going to say ignorance A, failure A, which of course, for a lot of students, those are scary. And Stuart Firestein in this book is making the case that, in fact, scientific innovation depends on ignorance. It depends on our ability to frame ignorance and embrace ignorance and see ignorance as an opportunity instead of something scary that we should try to run away from or hide. And so he concludes by saying, we must teach students how to think in questions, how to manage ignorance. Similarly, college presidents have talked about how essential this skill is. And yet only 27% of graduates actually believe that college taught them how to ask their own questions. And as we know, as a lot of us are working in K-12, we know that that problem begins much earlier. So in fact, I don't know if there's anyone in the room who has a 3 or 4-year-old at home or in their lives. This probably will ring a bell. The average 3 to 4-year-old is asking almost 30 questions an hour. That translates into over 200 questions a day. Some studies say up to 300 questions a day and over 10,000 questions a year. That question asking, even among 3 and 4-year-old, declines once they hit school. And then when you talk about looking at older children and adolescents, that question asking declines even further. So there are some really interesting research studies that are showing that in a group of students, there might not be any questions per hour, and it averages about 2 questions an hour. So similarly, in an hour of instruction, on average, educators are asking up to 120 questions an hour. A group of students is asking, again, around 2 questions an hour. So all of our work is dedicated to trying to think, how can we shift these dynamics? If this skill is so fundamental to learning, how can we make sure that every child has a chance to learn and practice that skill? So we're not alone, and it can be done. We know from teachers like Nicole and others around the world that you can teach the skill of questioning, and children can get better and better and better at it. So this is the book, Make Just One Change, Teach Students to Ask Their Own Questions. It's sort of the book that introduced the work of the Right Question Institute to education. And when that book came out in 2011, and I actually picked it up and tried it for the first time in my English classroom, there were a handful of teachers who had used the strategy, and now there are well over 1 million. A lot of that growth, and you see that we've grown into some other fields. The book has been translated. We've done work now with several different organizations who are all thinking about the importance of questions. That growth is because, again, all of our resources are available to educators for free. So what happens when students do learn to ask their own questions? There's a lot of research, including John Hattie's research, that confirms how important questioning is to different learning outcomes. John Hattie has talked about metacognition and how critical self-questioning is as a metacognitive strategy. There's also this one I thought was really fascinating. This is 2016 research at Michigan State that found curiosity is a fundamental predictor of the aspiration to become a scientist. And then there's what we hear from students. This is a Boston 9th grade summer school student. This student had failed 9th grade English, and he was repeating over the summer. And he said, the way it made me feel was smart because I was asking good questions and giving good answers. And you can imagine that smart is an adjective that student may not have used that often to describe himself in an academic setting. So we hear from educators, students, researchers, and parents how important questioning is. And so the question for us today is, what does that look like when you combine it with NGSS and the practices of an NGSS-based classroom? So this is the part where we're going to do some active work. So I'd like to invite you to just have a piece of paper nearby or have a Word document open that you can do some active work in. We're going to learn the question formulation technique by applying it. I am very grateful to Nicole for the prompt that we're going to use. This was her brainwave idea that I am stealing. So in a nutshell, the question formulation technique is a step-by-step process in which individuals produce questions, improve on their questions, strategize on how to use them, and then reflect on what they've learned. there are some rules that we're going to follow for producing questions. There's ask as many questions as you can. Do not stop to answer, judge, or discuss. Write down every question exactly as stated. In our case, because a lot of us are working individually, think of that rule as more write down every question exactly as it first came to mind. Try not to judge yourself. And then change statements into questions. So I'd like you just you don't have to use your chat box at all, but just think what might be difficult about following these rules. And Nicole, I might ask you, what do students think is difficult about the rules?
I actually asked them that today because we did a QFT today, and I asked them which rule do you think is the hardest to follow. And it's funny, they all, in different classes, they all talked about all of them because every student is really different. So I have some students that struggle to ask questions. Some students that, a lot of them do pick number 2. They have trouble not talking about the questions. And when Sarah and I do this activity with adults, they often pick that one too. And then the other one was number 3 when they're working with a partner. It's hard not to change their partner's question.
Thank you. So we're all going to try our best to follow the 4 rules when we're asking questions. They are challenging. All right, and I'm going to ask you to number your questions too. So I'm about to play your question or prompt for you. What I'd like you to do is just observe the first time through, and then I'll replay, and that's when I'll give you some time to start writing down questions. And when you're writing down your questions, number them and try your best to follow all 4 rules. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to play it a couple more times. So when you're ready, start to write down questions. Any questions that you have about that clip that I just played. I'm going to give us 3 minutes and we'll check back in 3 minutes. So for now, you are on your own, in your own paper, in your own space. Write down any questions you have about that video clip. Hold yourself to the 4 rules and number your questions. Your time starts now. So for now, you're just writing down any questions you have. You're not sharing anything just yet. Just write down your questions on your sheet of paper.
And I just typed the 4 rules into the chat box for anybody that needs to see them again.
Thanks, Nicole. You have 1.5 minutes. All right, so try to get down, just finish your last question, get down the last question. We are moving quickly today, and it can be a little bit frustrating. We're going to try to give you a taste of the whole process. So it will feel a little bit quick. All right, so the next part of the question formulation technique is categorizing questions. And there are a lot of ways that you can categorize questions for our purposes. There are 2 different kinds: close-ended, which can be answered yes, no, or 1 word, and open-ended questions, which require more explanation. So looking at the list of questions you just produced, I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes. I think we can do it, and identify your questions as either close or open-ended by marking them C or O, and just see if you can label them in the next minute or so. Your time starts now. A few more seconds. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on. It's okay if you didn't label all of them. Hopefully you labeled a couple of them. Okay, so we are using the chat box now, and I'll ask Nicole to read out a few responses. But I'm curious to hear, when you think about the close-ended questions, so those are the questions that are yes, no, or 1 word, what are some advantages of close-ended questions? So any advantages you can think of asking a close-ended question? Go ahead and use your chat box now.
I can start reading some of the responses. You want to wait a minute?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. We have quick to answer, establishes information quickly. It's quicker. Foundational information can be used in a short amount of time. You can Google the answers. Satisfaction of being able to find an answer quickly. Low level thinking to warm up brains. orients to the picture or text, it's to the point, it's a quick turnaround, could assess prior knowledge, good for nailing down basic facts, can lead to further questions.
That's perfect. What about, thank you, Nicole. What about disadvantages? So think of the other side of the coin now. So disadvantages of close-ended questions. Go ahead and type those in.
So we have limits possible answers. Oh no, wait, sorry, that might be, oh, they're going so fast. Stops thinking, no higher level thinking, not really discovery, doesn't invite further exploration, not expanding understanding, doesn't lead to in-depth understanding, disengages us one and done.
Thank you. All right, we're thinking about open-ended questions. So advantages that you all see to asking an open-ended question. So you can go ahead and use your chat box now. What do you see, Nicole?
I see deep thinking activates more in-depth, higher level thinking, deeper digging, lets the students elaborate, can lead to many discoveries, sidetracks, etc. Critical thinking and leads to elaboration, leads to discussion. Open-ended leads to deeper depth of knowledge and more questions, lead to conversation, encourages consideration of more possibilities, requires thinking from multiple perspectives.
So what about disadvantages? Any disadvantages you see to open-ended questions?
We have encourages consideration of more possibility, take more time, it's more time consuming, lack of time. Students could not understand, limited class time, takes many resources to answer, could get off topic, takes a lot of class time, down a rabbit hole, too vague if there's a misunderstanding, can lead us to guess and not use evidence or research to the answer.
Thank you. Thank
and
you
difficult
all.
to assess, which was an interesting point too.
Yeah, thank you all. So the point here is that there are advantages and disadvantages to both kinds of questions. And depending on the context, both kinds of questions can be good and valuable and right. Okay, so because we value both kinds, and you want to think strategically now about your list of questions, and think about a close-ended question that you could change into an open-ended question, and then an open-ended question that you could change into a close-ended question. And I'd encourage you to think about if there's something that you wish you had asked as open-ended, or something that you think might be more strategic to ask as close-ended. So try to think strategically there. So I'm going to give us a minute and a half. Try to change a question of each type and add it to your list of questions as a new question at the bottom. So minute and a half, your time starts now. About 30 seconds. Okay, that's time. So try to get down your last few words, and we're going to move on to the next step, which is prioritize questions. So we're asking you to think about the 3 questions that might help us figure out this phenomenon. So while you're prioritizing, think about the question focus, the prompt, which was the video of tides changing. And I want you to think about why you chose those 3 questions. So let's take a minute here. So see if you can choose 3 questions, and then we'll move on. Okay, so that was a quick minute. Do you have some priority questions? Hopefully. So we're going to ask you to choose just one question, so just one of your priority questions, and we'd like you to use the chat box to share one of those questions with us. Nicole, do you mind reading a few?
Sure. So we have, where does the water go? What do the numbers mean in the bottom corner? How does the location affect tides? How are the patterns to the tide changing affecting humans? Where was this short video shot? How does the change in tide affect the water life? How does the length of the tide impact wildlife? How have the patterns changed over time? Why does the water move in and out? What caused the changes? What time of year was this? But why did the movement of the shadows, they're going fast. It was about shadows. Are the tide swings in this region usually this extreme? How is the land affected by the tides? What is the connection between water and light? How do storms affect the tides? How could humans use the types of energy evident in this ecosystem in a sustainable way? How are living organisms affected by tides? Is the water level drop caused by a natural or man-made, are they related? And why does the direction of the cloud appear to change when the tide appears to change directions?
But I'd like, just as you can continue sharing a priority question if you didn't have a chance, but what are some patterns? I'm just curious, and Nicole, if you read a bunch of them, what are some of the patterns or categories that you're seeing? And you can, if you see something, feel free to put it in the chat box. Anything that came to mind that you saw? Oh, there are a bunch of questions about that.
So a couple people are saying they tend to be very open-ended questions, how and why questions. Todd said that environmental impacts, the questions, a lot of them are about environmental impacts, human or animal connections, cause and effect questions.
Cause and effect questions. It's interesting. I definitely thought I saw a pattern of, what is the cause of this phenomena? How do different factors play into that, like geography or time of year? There were lots of questions about the impact on the wildlife or on the land. Okay.
And then Ada just asked, are you thinking about how the questions mirror the NGSS science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts? And I was thinking that when I saw cause and effect and patterns. So this is a really neat way to ask the kids to identify some of those SEPs and CCCs. This would be a neat activity for the kids if they're old enough to be able to sort them that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move on. This is the last step before we share, and I really am looking here, instead of a full action plan, we're just looking for a couple bullet points, a couple ideas we have about some next steps that you could take to answer those priority questions. So we're thinking about, given the confines of the typical equipment and setup in science class, what would be some information you would want? What would be some ways to get that information, or some tasks or actions that you could take? So I'm going to ask you here, just take a minute and think about and write down a couple bullet points of what actions you could take to get the answers to your questions.
Really, this cookie thing is on like dog people. All right, go ahead.
What
I
is?
can't believe how many people signed up for cookies.
Oh, cookies. Did you pick a date yet?
I voted.
So a few seconds left. Okay, another quick minute. So, so we'd like you to share an idea. Let's do, for the sake of time, let's do an either or. So either share an idea you had about a next step or an action to take to get the answers to your questions, or share the numbers of your priority questions in your original sequence. So for instance, my priority questions were number 2, 4, and 7 out of 8 total. So just pick here, for the sake of time, one idea of a next step, or what was your sequence. And go ahead and type that in the chat box now.
So someone said 136, 134, 195, 1610. Next step, make firsthand observations of changing tides.
Mm-hmm.
We also have 478, 195, 134, 211, 12 out of 12, 11, 13, 14, 15, 124. And then someone's asking, what tools or materials do we need to utilize? Timer/clock, ruler, or depth meter?
Mm-hmm.
We have another 136, another number. 7, 11, 14 out of 15.
So the interesting thing about the numbers here is that this is why we don't tell students, oh, you have to come up with 10 questions, just because what if question 11 was the question that they were burning to ask? So, and sometimes it can be really interesting for students to take a look at the patterns of their priority questions and see that, one of their burning questions came only a few minutes in after they had asked a bunch of other questions, and that can be revelatory. So this is the last step of the question formulation technique, and I want to make sure that we have some time to spend on Nicole's classroom work. So I'd like everybody to just go ahead and share something in the chat box. Just either what did you learn, how did you learn it? You can go ahead, think about it, and then put it in the chat box if you want. But the reflection step is a really important part of the process, and sometimes it's very tempting to cut it right because it's at the end.
So someone wrote how we did QFT by doing. I liked the idea of connecting this to the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts of NGSS, changing the focus to more open-ended questions and allowing students to prioritize their questions, considering both open and closed-ended questions. Each participant has a unique perspective to offer. I learned to add another question connected to a previous question. I liked converting closed-ended to open-ended, and steps in the QFT process. Hearing from other folks about the importance of closed-ended questions, I was definitely biased towards open-ended. Nicole, and then one says that I will be doing much more in connecting to the SEPs and CCCs on my March 26th webinar. I like looking at all of the advantages and disadvantages of closed and open-ended questions. And another comment, I appreciated that both closed and open questions were valued. Curiosity is a fundamental predictor to becoming a scientist. Tie into NGSS is great.
Thank you all so much. It was really fun for me just to hear your questions, and Nicole will share what students asked about the exact same prompt. It is fascinating, and we really appreciate all of the thought and participation. So I want to share this very briefly. This is the process that you just went through. It is very simple. It fits on one slide. It's designed to do very sophisticated thinking. So one student told me that her brain hurts, but in a good way when she is doing the QFT. So you're doing 3 different types of thinking. There's divergent thinking, which is the really creative thinking in many different directions as you generate questions. You're doing convergent thinking. If I can get my slide to advance, here we go. So when you are prioritizing, when you're strategically changing question from type to type, trying to think about what word choice is going to work best for you, that's convergent thinking. And then importantly, there's metacognition, not just at the end, but when you're reflecting on the 4 rules as well. And also when you're thinking about sequence, that's metacognitive. So I'd like to turn it over to Nicole now. And she, like she said, she has a lot of amazing work, amazing work. And you can see more of it on the 26th, or you can connect with her on Twitter or email too. But here's some of it. So you tell me when to advance, Nicole.
Sure, go ahead. Perfect. So I was doing the topic of the universe and its stars with the NGSS standards, and I also had them watch the same video. I actually had them watch a few of tide changes just to generate even more questions, and the links are underneath the video. And I just want you to see the types of questions that they asked, because again, I only teach, I mean, they're 7th graders, so they're fairly young, but I just want you to see the sophistication and variety in their questions, and even some of their prior knowledge in their questions. And I think the next slide shows, some of them, like here we are, yeah, that if we bold some of them, just some of them, like number 5, saying do tides occur because of gravitational pull? So they're bringing gravity and temperature, tilt. So you can see their prior knowledge in science being pulled into the process, and that even 7th graders can ask complex questions just by following those rules with the QFT process and having a good Q focus, which was the video.
I just have to point out, I think they're so creative. These
8,
18, 19. I never would have thought of it that way.
Yeah, the way kids think about, like, well, what if? And those what if questions are really cool for pushing their scientific thinking, because if they understand the what if, then they understand what is. So one thing that you can do with students after is construct a driving question board. And I do this many different ways. So this is just one example. I'm constantly changing the process, and I'll show you more examples on the 26th. But in this case, we just used Post-it notes. So if you have limited resources, you can grab a bunch of Post-it notes, have the kids write their question and their initials on the Post-it notes. And I categorized these with them. I think they came up with their categories. Like some of the questions were about which ones were about gravity, or which ones were about the water changing. And then we were able to place them under the categories. After we construct the questions, in this case, I had them draw initial models of how they think tides work. They gave each other feedback in gallery walk format, which means they just look at each other's models. They made predictions, and then we all together came up with some investigation ideas to move ahead and figure out how we're gonna figure out more about tides. And then at the end of the unit, this actually, if you're looking at this picture, this was towards the end of the unit because you can see check marks too. So you can see that I had them go up towards some of the last days, and they went up and they were able to check off questions that they feel we tackled and answered. And you can see that there is a lot of power to doing this physically, not just digitally. I do both versions. I have a digital version and I have a physical version. I want the kids to always remember the questions that they ask and be reminded that they're there. So I do highly recommend having an actual driving question board in your classroom if possible. And if you're limited on space, I've seen teachers use chart paper and take it down and put it back up. You have to get a little bit creative because I know that I teach 5 different classes too, but I actually put all of their questions on one board just for organization purposes, but I have seen teachers keep a different board or a different chart paper for every class. So there are different ways to do that. Actually, the phenomenon I'm doing right now, I just literally did this today. I have the kids, it has to go with the NGSS standard of sound. And again, I'll take you through the process of the steps that I would take. And these steps are a little bit different than the prior steps. The prior steps that with watching the video and jumping right into the QFT and doing open close, that's a great place to start. You're still gonna get really great questions from kids. I've just been tinkering around a lot and trying to just do different things. So the next set of slides is just another version of the QFT that you might wanna try the other version first, just to kind of get your feet wet. And then you could try this version, which has a few more steps before the kids actually ask questions. So this particular phenomena, the students watch this video. It's about Daniel Kish. He's a man that uses flash sonar, so he clicks his tongue and he's able to navigate his world, and he is blind. And when I showed them this video, we can go to the next slide. The first thing we do is we watch the video a couple times, and they need to write down noticings and wonderings. And I don't mind if their wonderings are questions. I think that's a great way to jumpstart that curiosity. And then we come together in our scientist circle and we share out our observations, and I write all of them down. And then I actually give them, and so we haven't done the QFT yet, I give them an initial model to work on, and you can see in the second picture down that they're drawing out how they think Daniel is able to see using sound. And then they share their models together. So obviously when they make these models, they don't really know what to do. They're just guessing. So you already have more questions starting to formulate in their brains. And I tell them, if you get stuck, write down what you're stuck on, because I know that it's going to turn into a question for the QFT later. So it's a little bit of priming. And then we also, this is a new step I've added, but we also make a list of other related phenomena, because I have found that when I got more advanced with the QFT, I felt the importance of students asking about other things besides Daniel Kish and blindness. I wanted them to also ask about sound. So the related phenomena list was a great addition for them to ask about their initial models, the related phenomena, our noticings and wonderings, and it gives them a whole bank and a whole toolbox of things to ask about. And now I'm getting a lot more questions about things other than the actual person in the phenomenon. Here are some examples. You can see that we did categorize the questions. So we started at the beginning of the model, which is the sound source. So we call that category A. And the kids sorted their questions into category A, B, C, and D, which matched the initial model categories. I think B is sound traveling, so they could bunch up those questions into there. And again, you can see the sophistication of their questions and the variety and the creativity. And you can also see that they're not just asking about Daniel Kish, they're also asking about sound, which is going to lead us right to the standard and helping the kids figure out the standard. And it's funny that I look at these because I just had my kids do this today, and some of the questions are the same, which means that the method works because you're still going to get the questions that you need the kids to ask. So I know we haven't digitally put mine together today, otherwise I would have loved to show that. But just look at the sophistication again of a 7th grader being able to think through and generate these questions. And there is a link on there where I think you can see other categories too in your own time. So after the QFT, once we have all of our questions, we sit in the scientist circle. You can see the bottom right corner in that picture. We sit in a circle, and I have these category papers, and each student goes around, because I'm really big into equity. I want every child to have a chance to share his or her question and be part of our discussion. Every child has to read off at least one of their priority questions and then put it on the paper that matches its category, so that we can then add it to our driving question board. So the categories are all listed on this slide. There's also a parking lot category, so that you don't have to worry so much about what if the question isn't totally related to these categories? What do I do with that question? Keep it. The student can keep it. There's no problem with that. It can be an enrichment question. It can be a question that you get to later. It can be oh, you're done early with this. Why don't you research this extra parking lot question? And the worst that happens is that you don't answer it. And I think that that triggers more curiosity sometimes is, hey, you know what? We're scientists. We don't always get to every answer, but I hope that you still wonder about this question, and maybe you'll answer it later in your future. I think that that's a very honest conversation to have with them too. Here's just another example of a driving question board. This is it all put together. So you can see how they're categorized and organized into those categories so that they're easy to find and know where they belong. And on the right of it, you can see the initial model so that they're right next to each other. And the students made it. And then being able to answer the questions, you come up with, there are some scaffolds that I'll share on March 26th, some scaffolds I've put together to help kids come up with investigation ideas, because I do need to scaffold that with my 7th graders. If I just say, come up with some ideas, that's a little bit daunting for them. So I have some ways to help them with that. But they come up with investigation ideas to figure out certain parts of the model and certain parts of the phenomena. I always want them to ask. We don't always do an official QFT throughout the phenomena, but we do always ask questions after each investigation. So we start almost like a new driving question board, and we keep putting questions up on my curtains, because you have to be creative with space. You can see the pink curtains. They are littered with questions by the end. And as we figure out parts of our model or keep doing investigations, we always go back to our driving question board and see what we have figured out and what we have not. And I just want to show you how inspired kids get. On the bottom left corner, I've had a few of these every year as a student. Was really excited, emailed me at night and said, look what I found. I found a music box. I never knew I had this. They're just very excited, and they're owning it. They asked the questions. And then we interviewed some students a few years ago, and I think Sarah asked them questions about the QFT. And one student said, it's almost like she tricks us into learning science. So I thought that was pretty good on my part, that it was a natural thing. They learned it, and I tricked them into it. And then another student said, at first we were asking questions just to get to 10 or whatever number we had to ask. Then we realized that we actually got to learn about what we asked, and it really mattered. Now I ask questions because I want to know. So there's a purpose and ownership to asking those questions. And the next time you do a QFT, they have a purpose for it, and hopefully they'll be engaged and motivated to ask.
Nicole, thank you so much. I know we're running short on time right now, so what I'd like to invite everybody to do is maybe jot down a couple questions for Nicole now, because I at least, even if you can't attend the webinar, she can get all of them and use that to sort of structure what you do on the 26th. Because I think there's so much rich stuff in the work you've done with your students. It's amazing to see. So I'd really encourage people, jot down some questions now for her so she can address them, if not this afternoon, definitely on the 26th.
And I'll have resources and things that I use with my kids to help. So if you have any questions, I can try to dig through my resources and have them available for March 26th to help teachers teaching with the NGSS standards to help students ask questions and then answer their questions.
I just leave you with a couple thoughts about the particular relevance of question asking right now. I think one of them is that we live in the age of Google. This is another book recommendation for you. And another reason that really inspires a lot of this work with questioning is we think that questioning is deeply connected to democracy and participation in your community and being able to advocate for yourself. So Septima Clark is a great educator, great American educator, should get more credit than she does. And one of the things she said is we need to be taught to study rather than to believe, and to inquire rather than to affirm. So be part of that community of people who are investing in the next generation of citizens and their ability to really participate effectively in all kinds of democratic institutions, not just in school. So thank you all so much. I am going to turn it back over. Like I said, please put your questions in the chat box, and I will turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you all so much.
Hey, thanks. We'll take a couple minutes here at the end to go through some of those questions if people can stay online, but I want to run through just a couple of these last slides. So in the chat box, you will see a link to our post-webinar survey. Please do fill that out, especially if you would like to get the certificate of webinar participation. The only way you can get that is by filling out post-webinar survey. So please do take care of that. I'm going to run to the next slide. So as I said, we have this upcoming webinar. Registration is also up in the chat for March 26th. Next slide, please. This slide gives you the link to all of our archived webinars. So if you enjoyed this webinar, you might want to go back and see some of our previous webinar. It's a bit.ly link, so bit.ly/webinar NGSS. You'll find a list of all the webinars that we've done. This is the 5th year of our series, and you can view those. Again, this is brought to you by the National Association of Geoscience Teachers and the National Earth Science Teachers Association. On the next slide, here we go. We also have webinars, as well as the American Geosciences Institute, and they don't have a slide in here yet, but there will be one in on the March 26th webinar. So next slide, please. Here's our contact information, and we'll take a couple minutes. If people want to hang around, please do. And Sarah and Nicole can address some of those great questions that have popped up in the chat box. Nicole, do you have those, or do you want me to read them off?
Yes, I am answering some right now. Yes, so one of the good questions, I don't know, Sarah, if you want to speak to this, is supporting ELL students.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some techniques that you've seen teachers use in the past?
Yeah, we have more resources for ELL students, for early elementary students, for special education students on our website too. So I really encourage everyone to get over to writequestion.org at some point. But yeah, with ELL students, there are various different things. Some people have sentence stems. Some people, depending on the language proficiency, will do students can first ask questions in their native language, and then there's a translation activity. Sometimes we have ELL students write down some questions on their own, sort of have some quiet think time so they can write down individual questions, and then those questions go into a group. So there's all kinds of different little scaffolds that people have found effective.
There's just a little stream of questions from Todd. It says, how long does this take in your classroom? When I do it depends, I think. I know when I do the full process, I take 2 days to kind of do everything, but that includes investigation ideas. That's like start to end of the QFT process. But I think you can customize it because another high school teacher said they have limited time. I think you could practice it the first time doing it the way that Sarah presented, but then you can certainly customize because I think you know your students and your timing. And then do you feel like doing QFT and phenomena at the start of the unit is essential? I just off the top of my head, I would say that without questions at the start of the unit, I'm not sure how you're going to get to students generating investigation ideas. So I would say that somewhere within the first few days of presenting the phenomena, there should be some question generation, because that's one of the first steps to move them forward towards figuring out what they need to do to answer the NGSS questions or address the standards. I don't know if, Sarah, that makes sense.
Yeah, although, you know, the QFT I've seen used at every place.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
Like I've seen a science teacher use it as a form of giving peer feedback. So the students had different experiment designs and then they swapped and you asked questions as a form of feedback. So it's a really flexible tool and you could definitely use it in a lot of places. But I love the way that, Nicole, you set the tone. I mean, that they know from like just getting out of the gates, they know that they're expected to ask questions and that's how you learn.
Yes, I feel like the beginning is a good place to start, but then like Sarah said, you could sprinkle it in anywhere you want, but I'm not sure if you didn't do it at the beginning, at least one time, I'm not sure you would get the kids to own the phenomena and own their learning throughout it. But and then he had also asked what you just answered, do you only do this at the start of the unit? No, you can do it anytime you want, wherever you feel it's appropriate. So I've done mini QFTs where I do customize and we just take a moment and just ask more questions. Do you have any suggestions for a chemistry teacher? This is a class that's usually difficult to relate to students. I think it all depends on your phenomena. If you have a good Q focus or phenomenon, I think you can take this away with any good phenomena. And I know that on Twitter and Next Generation Storylines and Open Syed, there's a lot of good resources out there that will give you good ideas for phenomena. But if you have the right Q focus that's chemistry related, I think that you can get your chemistry students to definitely take this away and ask a bunch of great questions. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, email us more chemistry examples.
Yeah,
we have a lot of examples on our website from pretty much any grade, any subject area. So please feel free to email us and we can send those along.
and I also mentioned one teacher asked what it's like the first time they do this. The first time I do this with my students, I actually show them a video on the Right Question Institute website of 9th graders in an English classroom doing this. And my students literally model the rules after they watch these kids. And I feel like it's a nice shortcut to, instead of going over all the rules and just expecting them to do that, I actually have seen them just watch those 9th graders, and then the video's done, I go over the rules and they copy them. It's a great video, and I did mention that in the chat box, I think. And then just another question, I know probably running out of time, but when students develop the questions and we go over them, how do we transition to content and labs and investigations? I'll go into that in more depth on March 26th, but if you're not attending that one, please send me an email and I can share some of my resources with you. But I have scaffolds to help transition them over to getting them to think about answering them so that you dive into those questions. And another teacher did ask, how do you make sure that the kids ask the questions that you need them to ask? Some more scaffolding practice, but I can also share more resources in the next webinar, or just email me and I can send you some.
I think the important thing, the most important advice I would give is dive in, do some experimenting and model that for kids. We're asking kids to be open to asking questions and to value the things that they don't know. And do some modeling of that in your own design. And that's how Nicole started, is really, she tried it a few times. She did some tinkering. You find different types of phenomena and different types of prompts that work better than others. And really the only way to get there is being willing to sort of dive in and tinker a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you so much for just a really excellent webinar, very interactive, and we love to see that. So Nicole and Sarah, thank you again. Everyone who's still with us, thank you for staying around with us for a little bit of a post-webinar discussion here. And I hope that you've all grabbed the link for the March 26th webinar, and we'd love to have you back for that one as well. So thank you to Andrew in the background for running things, to my colleagues Carla and Ed for co-sponsoring this webinar, And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.